Welcome all, especially you, Sue, to the 2020 RTPI Southwest Young Planners President's Visit. My name is Elliot Dommett. I'm a planning technician at Stantec, and I sit on the Devon, Cornwall and Somerset Young Planning Steering Group. I'm joined here today by the chairs of each regional steering group to explore the topic of planning in a post-COVID-19 world. There is an agenda for today. Once everyone has introduced themselves, I'll start with a general update on our activities in the Southwest before moving on to the body of our presentation, where the chairs of each of our steering groups will have 15 minutes each to present and discuss 4 different topics of post-COVID-19 planning we feel are especially important to consider: home and digital working, purpose-built student accommodation, the future of public houses, and changing perspectives on open space. I think now would be a good moment for everyone to introduce themselves. So Chris, should we start with you?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Sue. I'm Chris Moore, Chair for Gloucestershire Young Planners and planning consultant with Plainview Planning.
Okay. And Carla?
Oh, sorry, hard to unmute. I'm Carla Fulgoni. I'm the chair of Dorset Young Planners, and we set up about 4 years ago, Dorset Young Planners, and I've been a member of the steering committee since its inception back then. I work for a house builder, McCarthy & Stone, as part of their in-house planning team.
Okay, Claudia? Claudia?
Sorry, I'm a member of the Gloucestershire Young Planners. I joined this year with Chris. I am a planner from Ridge & Partners.
Thank you, Claudia. Emily?
I'm Emily Johnson. I'm the chair of the West of England Young Planners. I've been the chair for about 2 years now. Thanks.
Brilliant. Frances, how about you?
Hi everyone, I'm Frances Summers and I am a member of the Dorset Young Planners. I haven't been a member very long. I just got roped into it this year and really enjoying it, and I think I'm by far the oldest one there, but never mind.
And Keegan?
Hi all, hi Sue. I'm the chair for the Devon, Cornwall and now Somerset Young Planner Steering Group. I'm also a planning consultant at Avalon Planning and Heritage in Exeter.
Excellent. And Sue, you need no introduction here.
Yeah, I'll give you one quickly. I'm Sue Manns,
Sure.
and I am absolutely thrilled to be with you. I love being president, I must admit. I'm having a fantastic year, but one of the really, really special things for me is actually meeting up with the young planners. And every time I do, I keep wishing I was 30 years younger, because the future of planning is just looking so good with people like yourselves, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real highlight.
Brilliant. So I'll start with a general update on our activities in the Southwest. Up until 2016, young planner activity generally occurred in and around Bristol. While this was understandable, it did also highlight to us the importance of enhancing opportunities and support for young planners across the rest of the region. And in a bid to expand the reach of the network, the Devon and Cornwall Young Planning Steering Group was established in 2016 and broadened in 2020 this year to include Somerset, while the Dorset and Gloucestershire steering groups were established in 2017 and 2019 respectively. Since then, our groups have coordinated multiple cross-centre events with wild success, including the Gloucestershire Young Planners events on ecology and the future of self-build planning, which both received great feedback from attendees. The Dorset Young Planners also recently held an online CPD event on how to build a town square and the implications of COVID-19 on public space design. And this was part of the Planner Live Online, and in turn it was used by hundreds of people all over the world. And in the west of England, the Young Planners have hosted an array of interesting CPD events, ranging from public sector housing delivery with Bristol City Council to community consultation with Turley and LUC. As well as the 6th annual Boat Social in 2019, the West of England Young Planners were present at the annual RTPI dinner and presented winners with their prizes during the event. This year, the South West had been organising a mix of socials, quizzes, site visits, CPD presentations and APC events. However, since our worlds were turned upside down by COVID-19, our activities have moved mostly online in the form of CPD webinars, though I know Dorset did manage a virtual social in the form of a planning pub quiz, which went very well. Good work. And as we look forward at further expanding the network in the South West and engaging with its communities, there could be an opportunity for a new group comprising the east of Somerset and the county of Wiltshire. We're currently looking at how cross-boundary young planning activity could take place with the southeast region. Also of note, the last time the South West hosted a Young Planning National Conference was in 2014. As we continue looking forward, we're excited about prospects of hosting one again in the near future, COVID willing. But alas, we didn't invite everyone here today to discuss our strategy. The purpose of this visit is to present and discuss 4 topics we feel are especially important to consider in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. How can planning respond to this and future health emergencies? And how will planning function in a post-lockdown world? What is planning's role in a green economic and social revival? And what can we expect to see from our places as we lay the foundations of more resilient communities? The presentations compiled by my young planner colleagues herein will aim to answer some of these questions, while some will raise more. We believe these 4 topics, along with others, will be central to the planning response to COVID-19 and hope to contribute to the planning discourse around these subjects. To kickstart the day, we'll start with a piece on home working and planning by the Dorset Young Planners Steering Group. For the purposes of this event, and so you don't have to try and remember your question from 4 slides ago, we'll have roughly 10 minutes of discussion between each of the 4 topics. Carla, would you like to get us started?
Yes, thank you, Elliot, for that introduction. Charlotte, you might want to just click a couple of slides in to my first slide, if that's okay. The pre-COVID slide just next. Thank you. Lovely. Well, hello everybody again. Ironically, for my discussion topic, I went back into the office this week briefly for the first time since early March, as I needed to collect some files. But as Elliot mentioned, I would like to talk about home working or digital working for a few minutes. So I've personally been one of the millions of people who've been furloughed over these last few months. I've been back working in the office for the last month and really started to sort of think about what this changing way of working means for us as planners. You know, the coronavirus pandemic has changed the way we work as planners and for the public in general, perhaps irreversibly. And as you can see from my first slide, with the image of different ways from working, this can mean different things for different people. I was amazed to learn that 70% of British workers had never worked from home before the coronavirus lockdown, which was quite a shock to me. And as my slide shows, for the past 4 months, 20 million people in the UK are estimated to be working from home, on kitchen tables, in garden offices. And yeah, this is a massive shift from what we've been used to, and it's not something that many people could see coming. So a lot of us were completely unprepared for what it meant to work from home. You know, and now that lockdown's starting to be lifted for so many industries, not for all, I imagine the knock-on effects of how this affects our working life will be substantial, and I'd like to talk about that today. Next slide, please, Charlotte, if that's okay. Thank you. So obviously we've all been affected by this, and as planners our thoughts naturally turn to what this means for our sector. How can the planning system respond to a post-COVID working life? Many of the things that I've put on this slide can't be known yet. On a personal note, I work for a national house builder, and we've been told that we can't go back to work in the office unless it's completely necessary, like picking up my files this week, until November. But you know, who knows if that will change if we have, God forbid, a second spike. And actually, one sort of thinks that can life go back to normal? And there are a lot of positives to one's working life from working from home. But as planners, we have to think what that means for our places, our towns, and the existing housing and office stock in the UK. So there's a couple of things that I've put on the slide which we can discuss about how the planning system can respond. A lot of people, as you can see from this slide here, have garden offices or these pods. There's a massive business in, before lockdown in having these, and these will become, I predict, in demand. But in a country like the UK, can they work forever? Can you work in a garden office in the deepest, darkest stretches of winter in the northernmost parts of Scotland? Maybe not. So we need to sort of think about how we can have adaptable working, adaptable housing. PD will allow us to deliver some of these offices, and PD will also allow us to extend and adapt current housing stock. But how quickly and how this can work for some people, and it might not be financially viable for some people to do that. So how the planning system will respond to that will be quite interesting. Also through house builders, they'll need to respond to this, but often financial viability gets in the way of adding more space. So maybe a response should be more adaptable dwellings rather than dwellings with garden offices or space. You'll see on the next slide, one of my steering group members mentioned that her utility room had now become her office. So using spaces in different ways might be the answer. And we know that there's already sort of live-work units that are being delivered. So the planning system has responses, but it'll be interesting to see how you Sue and the rest of the young planners feel that we can respond to this. And how will this affect our towns and cities? Commute patterns of commuting may change. Will the norm be for people to move from the suburbs into the town centres for work every day? Maybe not. Maybe it's good for environment that doesn't happen. But what does that mean for the vitality and viability of our high streets? Next slide, please, Charlotte. So obviously, I don't have all the answers on this. You can see this little office space that's been put under the stairs. I'm working from my lounge, as you can probably see at the moment. We have a spare room, but with 2 people working from home, I got the short straw and I'm in here. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on this. I've had interesting discussions with Francis and the rest of the Dorset young planners on it. My experience as a planner that's worked in the private sector will be different from those of you that have worked in public sectors. And personally, I've been really impressed with how councils and PINs have responded with virtual planning meetings, committees, virtual appeals. There's been some really positive responses towards digital working in planning, which could bring more people into planning, assuming people have internet access. And I think sometimes we forget in the industry that planning can be quite a daunting space for people to come into. So interactive committees, interactive local engagement sessions actually could bring people into planning. I often think when we're holding a public exhibition for one of our sites, we hold them between sort of 2 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock at night and assume that people can fit into that space, but bringing children home from work, after work, and some people can't get out there to engage with the system. So having these more adaptable ways of working might bring more people into it. We put our exhibition slides, which we usually would put in a local church hall or something. We're putting them all online now. We've got chat bots so people can respond to ask questions, and we've got a little WhatsApp message where we can send our answers in, so people can be more engaged. And also Francis, who I've mentioned on the call, had a great point, and one that I hadn't thought about, which was one of the benefits of working from home is the increased flexibility that it provides, and this improved work-life balance is more conducive to family life. And we're always looking as the RTPI to be a more inclusive, a more balanced profession, and that shift could really encourage people that might previously not have thought about working in planning into the profession, which can only be a positive thing that's come out of a terrible pandemic. So yeah, really, just to summarise, it's far too early to say how the planning profession will respond to this. I know that we've had a few changes to PD and things like that have come along. and I can see a typo on my last bit of my slide. How the working world will change, we can't know. But you know, do you think that we'll ever go back to normal? And do you think it's a good thing if we don't go back to normal? So yeah, over to you guys. What do you think?
My view is that is really, really thought-provoking. So thank you so much, Carla, on that. There's so much that you said that really resonates with experiences that I guess we've all had. But a couple of things I just wanted to pick up on that I thought were really interesting. And it's not quite directly on the home working side, although I've got a question on that for everybody. But it's actually on the digital side of things and what digital technology can actually give us. And I think the thing that I've observed, it'd be really interesting to see if it is the same across the board, is that one of the positives that's come through is that we are much more inclusive of everybody as a result of digital engagement. We're more inclusive in terms of community engagement, in terms of planning committees, people can go and watch them online. But we're also more inclusive as a profession. And so many of the events that we used to put on, you had to be able, I don't know about you, but I used to sometimes find them really difficult because of when they were in the day to be able to get there, and it would cut into other meetings you had, and it was hard, especially when I'd got kids. I'd need to get back to sort something out, and it made involvement really, really difficult. Whereas the fact that you can now either be involved online or you can pick it up in the evening when everything's quiet and just watch it, to me, that is just absolutely the way we need to go. So when you talk about going back to the old normal, I'm not sure I want the total old normal. I'd like a mix, a blend, something that actually picks the best of both. So that's just a thought that I've got. The question I was actually going to ask you, and it's sort of linked to home working and to this new digital world that we're in. It's sort of twofold. One, is your own home suited? And when you bear in mind that in 2050, we look at the housing stock in 2050, 80% of that housing stock in 2050 exists now. So we've got a problem not just of building new ones that are more flexible, but is what we've got suitable? So that's one question I'd just be interested to know people's thoughts on. And the other one links to something Elliot almost sort of started me thinking about, and that's the fantastic way you've started to set up all these new networks across the region to reach out to the different parts. But has digital engagement and where we are with this new way of working, has that meant you can actually do cross-regional events a bit like this? So is that another win from it? So sort of over to you to sort of answer all those or share your thoughts.
I'd like to just go back to the Dorset Council. I work for Dorset Council. The Dorset Young Planners event that we held just the other week. We had people from all over the world attend that, and there were 273 people came. So I definitely think that, you know, moving to a more digital platform, I think we're moving in that direction anyway. It's just, you know, this has accelerated it, hasn't it? I wouldn't want to go back now. I definitely wouldn't. In terms of the digital the digital age sort of enabling more inclusivity within the planning profession, I think that is right to a degree, but I work in policy, and our issue is we still have the issue, particularly in Dorset, that people don't have access to good enough internet to download all these massive PDF evidence documents, or they don't have access to the internet, or they don't have a computer. So we still have to reach that group. We have looked at different ways of doing that, and that's maybe pop-up stalls in places where people can come and talk to us, or people can phone into webinars. So there's ways around it, but I still think there's some people like to get their hands on physical copies and actually read it. So that would be my answer to that. In terms of policy as well, is I do think that it should be something that we forward plan now. I think we should be sort of including some sort of solution for office space in the future. I don't think everyone would take it up, but if there was some sort of flexible use on so many new dwellings. I think that would definitely help. As for retrofitting, then that's where maybe garden pods and things could come in. But I think I wouldn't want to see more PD rights that would maybe not produce good places. You know, that's all I have to say.
I had just something to pick up on what Carla had to say, and it was about the viability argument of big house builders, which seems to always come into play with them type of schemes. And you do notice that obviously the sort of more mass housing and things that we're pushing for now have limited space in them anyway, just because of the nature of the sites. But it's kind of twofold, because as well as having limited space, you'll also find that a lot of them have conditions on that prevent them from doing any more development to them under PD. So there's no chance for an outbuilding or for an extension office or anything like that. And that kind of tends to come from both angles, because in one hand it's the viability argument, but then the other hand it's the council saying, well, you've provided, I suppose, the minimum of what we want, and therefore we don't want you building any more. So I suppose, yeah, what Francis said about forward planning is probably right, because we're going to need to think of options to either find a way of increasing them or balancing out the viability argument to provide the home office option, particularly if we want people working from home, which has obviously been quite a success because everyone seems to be managing okay at the moment.
If I may, sorry, go ahead, Emily.
No, you can go first. It's all right.
I was just going to throw my 2 cents into this, and that's I think certainly the benefit of this has always been that the way we practice planning has certainly seen a lot of benefits, and a lot of what's been said already has sort of covered that, in the sense of I certainly am grateful not having to travel across the country to sit in a planning committee in an evening, you know, and having it all digitally means that it certainly means it makes it a lot easier to share the information with people, which certainly is to the benefit of everyone who wants to sort of take part in the system. The future certainly will need to be forward planning in terms of things like high-speed internet to rural areas in particular, where the internet may be more difficult to get hold of, and planning for the types of properties we look in the future. So maybe whether or not we start to challenge things like space standards to include things like working spaces as part of that, to ensure that flexibility is included in future.
I was just going to touch on the comment that you had, Sue, about the suitability, and it may create more questions or not, but as kind of like a younger person, I'm kind of been working and living in a shared house, so there's kind of 3 of us living here, all working from home. Out of preference, I would quite prefer to have a separate space to work, but otherwise we'd all be kind of sat in the lounge together, which probably wouldn't be the best use of our time. But yeah, kind of thinking that it has been good to work from home, and I kind of went back to my parents' house who do have a separate kind of study to work in, but it could, yeah, for the longer term, it may have more effect on those that are sharing houses and don't have access to gardens. But it was interesting that Carla mentioned about the pods, because we've kind of got like a shared garden, so whether it was we kind of in the future had some sort of working pod in the garden, so you do have like the separate working and living space. So yeah, it was kind of just a kind of input, but yeah, it might create more questions about kind of thinking more futuristic about it.
Yeah, so following on from what Emily's just said, I've recently, in the last 2 weeks, just moved into a house. I was in a flat before, but it was quite cramped, and my partner was working from home as well. So in a way that did incentivize us to move and have a bit more of that space. I work in Cheltenham as well, and I just feel, aside from that, maybe there should be more of a push for co-working spaces. I know there is one in Cheltenham. It's fairly pricey as well, but maybe there should be more of an initiative from the government or from local authorities to push those spaces in probably smaller towns as well. I imagine there's obviously a fair few in the cities, but there's quite a lot of consultancies now in smaller towns. So I think that would be good.
Yeah, just following on from that, I think as much as many of you have mentioned about the poor connection in a lot of rural areas, I think co-working spaces is a good solution for access to high-speed internet in rural areas in the intermittent time before there's real plans in place to get that access.
I think it might also help with the emotional impact of working from home, you know, so the sort of mental health impact when you're isolated all the time. I know that a lot of my colleagues have felt this when we're used to working in an office, we're not used to working from home. So when we made that move, it did impact on people's mental health to begin with, certainly. So I think having that co-working space where people can go and they can socialise, even if it's not with colleagues, I think that would be really beneficial.
I think those were really, really interesting answers. Keegan, did you have a chance?
Yes, I did. Sorry, I was the point about this volume house building. Yeah, I started off. Sorry.
So, and I think really lots of food for thought there, but I'm also conscious we need to move on, don't we, Elliot?
Yes,
Otherwise,
we do.
I could talk forever with you on this.
Okay, we'll move on to the next one then. So Keegan, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, so my topic is purpose-built student accommodation. I will be honest, because I started a new job probably about a month and a half ago now. I've actually been back in the office since, but as responsibly as we can, and we are in a shared office space, so there hasn't actually been anybody else in, so we've kind of benefited from the fact that there isn't anyone here. But our building itself is surrounded by either established student-built accommodation or building student accommodation that's in the process of being built. So we are essentially surrounded in the city centre, and it seems the type of development that is just occurring more and more. And there is certainly a push in certainly your larger towns and cities for student accommodation to be built. If you could put me on to the next slide, please, Charlotte. So I've picked 3 examples. 2 are very close to me, which are the barn in Exeter and the Honiton Inn, or the site of the former Honiton Inn, and Beckley Court in Plymouth. I've picked these because they're fairly large sites, quite prominent, some more prominent than others. If I know that there's been certain views on certain buildings of these, but so I'll start with the barn. So that was described. So it was the demolition of an existing building, redevelopment to provide student accommodation with a mixed-use ground floor. Honiton Inn was the demolition of a former pub, which was then being redeveloped into a mixed-use scheme, including student accommodation. Beckley Court in Plymouth was a 22-storey building comprising 507 student bedrooms, and again with a mixed-use ground floor. For each of these, so I went through and had a look, and I'm aware that the description of development's not always enough to kind of enforce its use, but some of these were held by condition, and I can't remember now looking if I actually put the conditions in. I might not have done, but certain ones were held through condition that they should only be student housing, which creates their own problems at the moment, particularly because a lot of these are vacant, and as well as being student houses, they having the students in them obviously provides quite a big contribution to the cities that they're in, particularly for the sort of viability of the high street and the nightlife and other key parts of the city, which at the moment are all on hold. So yeah, as these sit vacant, we're trying to think of alternative options, particularly if they are constrained by planning conditions or other restrictions on the development themselves. Charlotte, if you could put me on to the next one. Thanks. So I've kind of structured these as questions. So maybe if I go through them, then we can perhaps go back to them as the points of discussion. But permitted development change of use. So a new part 12A of Class A the permitted development order, was enabling use of university buildings for temporary hospitals, coronavirus facilities or testing units. So there's obviously been an appetite to find an alternative use for these buildings, but is this really a long-term solution? Is this, although there is a key issue at the moment, and it is something that we're going to need, are permitted development uses going to need to extend to something a little bit more long-term? I suppose particularly if students don't come back, or there's no appetite for cramming lots of students into the city, because I don't know how we're going to achieve much social distancing in some of these units. Which then takes me on to my next question: is if not students, then who? Obviously, that is a response to the COVID crisis. So with them now being vacant, who do we put in this accommodation? Could it be change of use to more residential purposes, or could it be a change of use to service offices, which might fall back onto the last point about co-working spaces? At the same time, because there would be individual units, I suppose they would create individual office spaces. So in that sense, you could maybe achieve a degree of social distancing as we try and bring people back into the cities, but in a safe way. And then looking at the future impacts of these developments. Now, depending on how serious it is and how long term this is, and the way that universities look to kind of act in the future, particularly if they're looking to do more long distance learning or lessen the overhead on the amount of building space they need, or reducing, not necessarily reducing student numbers, but reducing the number of students, particularly on campus or in the cities. So where these temporary uses not required as much as anticipated, would alternative uses be more viable, and can any alternative use be of similar economic benefit to the host city? I would say go on to the next slide, but we might as well stay here so that we can kind of address the points one by one. But I'll pass it over to you guys for discussion.
Wow, that was thought-provoking, wasn't it? I suppose, in a way, and I'll say I lecture at Birmingham University on the postgrad RTPI accredited course on a part-time basis, and certainly the future in terms of students coming back on campus is something very much that's out there for discussion. So I suppose my first question, you're closer to it than me. What's your feel about, from people about whether they would go back, or would they look to go to university this year? Would they look to defer? And if they were going, would they look to stay in student accommodation as we have it, with all the issues that Keegan has raised about social distancing? I think the other question that I'd sort of throw out is, in terms of office space, my personal feeling is that if you listen to the leaders of business, they're saying we're not going back to the office as it was. We're never going to have the 7,000 people in one place in one office. It's just not the way it's going to happen. So we're going to have probably in the main town, certainly in the main city centres, a glut of office space. So we've got an issue about, well, what do we do with that? And a lot of our local plan policy is actually built around, identifying space for high quality office accommodation, both within town centres, city centres, but also sometimes on the fringes. So how does that actually play in? Because whilst you have some universities located fairly close to a town centre or a city centre, like Birmingham University, others, like Warwick University, are out on a campus. So much going around in my head when I think about this. So it'd be really interesting to see what's going around in your head and see if it's the same as mine. I don't have answers, by the way.
Something I wanted to add about what you mentioned there, Keegan, about certain student accommodation being restricted by condition to students of that specific university. There is talk about through Section 73 variating that condition to allow the accommodation to be used by more students than just who attend that specific university. So opening up student accommodation to multiple more colleges, especially language colleges and international colleges who find it hard to place students, could cohabit them and would make better use of student accommodation. And then student accommodation blocks that I suppose are more appropriate to be modified into build to rent formats, then they could proceed with that in the knowledge that there was more of a move in cohabiting different students from different colleges.
Well, that was going to be my point actually, Elliot. I live in Bournemouth, you know, obviously being in the Dorset Young Planners, and we have a lot of language schools, and a lot of the people that attend these language schools come in from abroad. But you know, will that be happening? I mean, I think that's been one of the massive challenges in this sector, is, you know, not knowing whether we'll get the overseas pupils coming over and students. But yeah, I think that would be a good idea in Bournemouth, because they're always looking for accommodation in people's homes. But actually, these blocks could be adapted with a level of sort of pastoral care that you'd need for sort of younger students. But I think that's a great idea and a great opportunity, especially here. We've got two big universities in Bournemouth which have expanded exponentially in the last few years, and there's a lot of housing stock out there. You do think that it could be used in that way really quite easily. So it's a great idea.
If I can sort of add on to that, yeah, I think as planners, because we always need to be forward planning, there's always that sort of things like COVID certainly are going to shift the way we view society and the way we build around that. But there's also a sort of temptation almost trying to not to knee-jerk to things as well. And what I mean by that is that students, from the ones I know who want to go to university, will be going because they want to have a big part of their university experience will be the social aspect. And so certainly things like the student accommodation aspect won't change, because they'll want to be part of the halls, they want to be part of that experience. They won't, I think a lot of students are being put off by just the idea of an online university course, for example, because they won't get that element of that experience. And so it's whether or not we should be looking at, is there any sort of temporary uses that we could find for a student accommodation which will sort of fill the space and the void that for many students at the moment for the next year, 2 years, and is whether or not there's ancillary uses that might work with the student accommodation. So things like maybe hotel uses, for example, or anything maybe with the hospitality industry, and whether or not we can vary conditions relatively straightforwardly for universities to allow this mixed use to sort of cohabit with students. So yeah, I think it's certainly an interesting topic.
My point kind of has kind of leads on from that, where the people that I've heard that are going to university are kind of deferring. So it's kind of looking at those temporary uses, and just something that kind of thought about through Carla's presentation is that living in Bristol, there is a lot of homeless people, and they've kind of been living in these hotels temporarily. And they're kind of now slowly getting moved out as things are kind of returning a little bit back to normal. And the hostels and things around Bristol have not been able to open because you can't socially distance in them. So it's whether thinking, if it's a temporary accommodation, whether because it is a student accommodation, it's kind of a similar use already, whether that would be something that could be something used as a temporary use for a certain period of time.
I know that there are in Coventry, they're currently working out a way to they've got some publicly owned student accommodation there, and I think they're looking into trying to set up a system with the emergency housing list and the social list to try and get people in there for the duration that it's available for.
That's the point I was going to bring up actually, is can it be used for temporary housing? But obviously, not obviously, but in my opinion, and from what I've heard from people who are about to go to university, they're only going to defer for a year. And as Chris said, there's a lot of value in simply the social experience of going to university. I'm a mum, so I think of it in that terms. It helps their independence. So it would just be temporary housing. It would be great for the next year, but then after that, what do we do? So that opens a whole new can of worms there. But yeah.
Just following on from that as well, I know someone that is going into their third year at university in September, and this kind of experience for her, which has affected probably half their second year, has been quite strange. You know, exams are being cancelled, friends have become more distant, etc., etc. So I know in that respect, people that are going back in September that have already been to university, I think Sue, you mentioned, you know, would students want to go back, and would COVID kind of affect reasons why they would go back? In that sense, I don't think it will. I think people are still quite young, and they just want to socialise and interact. But in terms of temporary uses for the student accommodation, I think that point goes well in hand with Carla's presentation about co-working. I think it, and as Emily said before, you know, she's in a a shared house, and it's whether the student accommodation could provide a bit more of that separation of having your own room and maybe a bigger space to work, and then could you then provide a co-working space as well? And obviously we need to think about measures, etc., but maybe that's kind of what could be used at and used within the student accommodation over the next year. But as Frances said as well, what happens when eventually COVID hopefully is over and all the students want to come back, and then where do all those people go? So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens with that.
I think those were really interesting comments, and I just hope those who own the accommodation or are listening around about heard all those, because I think there's so much from that that gives opportunity in different ways. And I really do take your point about people going away. My three sons, and I live just north of Birmingham, my three sons went to York, Bristol and Cambridge, so you could not get, you know, more dispersed. I think they wanted to get away from me, but still. So that was, I think, really informative, and it's something that I totally agree with you. And let's hope that other people are listening, and we can get that message out about thinking out the box sometimes, and thinking in different ways. And it's not one solution that's applied everywhere. And I think that came through from what you're saying. It's about getting the right solution in the right place at the right time that actually matches things. So it's not just saying you can do that, but it's actually you can do. So I'm also, again, looking at the time. I realise I could talk again on this one, but Elliot, do we need to move on?
Actually, that was perfect timing. So on to you then, Chris, with public houses and planning.
Thank you very much, Elliot. And yeah, what a great topic, the best sort of British institution of the public house. Claudia is going to help me and present this one. So Elliot, if you wouldn't mind going, oh, sorry, Charlotte, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, and I'm going to hand over to Claudia for the first bit.
So yeah, I'll firstly be talking about public houses and how they were dealt with as part of the planning process pre-COVID. So just a stat for you, around 25% of pubs have closed since 2001. These have mainly been mostly out of town centres due to difficulty in accessing those pubs without driving, and also the more larger establishments as well. There's primary issues for owners of a pub, which would include the costings of running the pub, business rates, but it's balancing that with the change in drinking culture I think we've seen over the last few years, and how this generation are probably more tailored to having a more kind of European cafe drinking, going to an establishment like that rather than a more traditional British pub. But of course, alongside that, there are social benefits to a pub. For existing communities, they're seen as more of a hub, particularly in more rural communities, and they can provide economic support and growth for those areas as well. And as we all know, the UK is well known for the pub culture, so it is seen as a national culture and identity across Britain. So how has this reflected within planning policies so far pre-COVID? The Localism Act in 2011 enabled pubs to be designated as assets of community value, which gives them a protective status, so they can't be as easily converted or removed or have their use changed. As we know, paragraph 192 of the NPPF seeks to plan positively for community facilities, such as pubs. When submitting an application, however, I think there's more of a view, how would you say it? It's tailored more to kind of the economic values of a pub. So when you submit an application, you usually have to submit some viability or marketing evidence alongside that, usually 6 to 12 months. And that kind of focuses more on the economic value of it rather than maybe more the social value of it. And I think then there becomes a difficult balance for planners to play with there, because, you know, usually with those types of applications, if someone wants to change the use of a pub, they'll get a lot of negative local response. And yeah, it's just how local authorities deal with that. Interestingly, a recent appeal decision came out in June last year, so last month, which involved the change of the use of a pub to residential use. It was in a rural village, and the inspector basically provided a lot of weight towards the social aspects of that pub, albeit it wasn't actually designated as an asset of community value. There was viability information submitted as part of that application, but he considered it didn't deal with the impact the change of use of the pub would have on the more local residents. It was kind of dealt with, the viability information was dealt with a bit more widely than that. And I found a quote which actually responds to what COVID-19 may have had, the impact COVID-19 may have had on this, which I'll just read out quickly because I thought it was quite interesting and quite bold from the inspector as well. I acknowledge that the current circumstances surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic are likely to have worsened the forecast for the viability of the pubs. However, the pandemic is a temporary situation and should not be used to govern the assessment of the long-term viability of a pub or to influence decision-making on important matters such as the retention of community facilities that would serve and support communities for decades. And with that, Charlotte, you can go on to the next slide, and Chris will talk about post-COVID.
Thanks, Claudia. So yeah, I mean, as Claudia was saying, it was a bit sort of it's been a bit doom and gloom for pubs for the last few years, I think, when it comes to business. And I'd like to say that there's sort of light at the end of the tunnel, but unsurprisingly, 2020 has not been a particularly good year for pubs. And so the sort of general figures at the moment, so from I think it was the Financial Times was saying that it's been the lowest sale in beverages for over 20 years, but that's to be expected. And so whilst it's great to see pubs reopening, social distancing certainly is continuing to have an impact on the market aspect. So certainly most pubs are forecasting that they're getting about 30% of capacity that they would normally expect from a pub. And to some extent, that social distancing, I think that my personal view as well is I think it's a lot of people still remaining cautious about going out as well at the moment. And certainly I hope that that changes over time once confidence builds again to go out. The other aspects certainly relate around actually outside of COVID. So things like what's the future from Brexit, for example, with the potential additional tariffs. Now, obviously, all of this is sort of business and marketing, but that in itself has an influence on how we deal with it from a planning perspective, because as Claudia mentioned, at the moment traditionally planning policies are framed around viability and marketing rather than necessarily purely on social aspects as well. And so it's whether or not the question, I guess, for us is, should we actually as planners be focusing more on retaining pubs from a sort of almost cultural perspective and almost social perspective as well, so combining those two elements, because I'm sure many of us as Brits don't want to see the loss of the pubs as a cultural asset to our sort of national identity. So it's a question of whether or not that needs to be integrated more in policy rather than focusing purely on market to influence those matters. Charlotte, if you could please go on to the next slide, that'd be great. So yeah, that kind of is reflected in our views on the planning response. So the question is, do we actually need to look at possibly things like greater emphasis on public consultation, for example, as part of the change of use process, given that there's a social aspect here from things like small village communities, particularly in this part of the country. We have a lot of rural communities who love their pubs and want to see them protected. The other views is, should we be trying to be a bit more proactive as planners and seeing how we can support pubs through diversification? So I know I've seen plenty of examples of where pubs have possibly reduced their floor space to become micro pubs or microbreweries, and with that have brought in another use class with that to try and keep the viability of the pub going, as obviously economics does have an influence to some extent on that. A common one being things like B&B uses or other sort of small shops, for example, that sort of thing to help support the business aspect. I think Claudia was going to talk about the last 2 points there.
Yeah. As you know, we've already seen a relaxation in planning legislation, where in March, April time this year, pubs were allowed to actually serve as takeaways under PD rights. So is there more opportunity to explore either removal or amendments to PD rights? And the following slide will kind of elaborate more on that as we have some examples to share. If you could go on to the next slide, Charlotte.
Yeah, so I was going to start by talking about the Keep in Wallingford. This is my hometown, and the guy who I went to university with decided to set up his own pub. But by doing that, he went into what was an old picture frame shop and decided to do a change of use. That in itself, so you kind of got a modern take of a pub in the, like as it shows in the image below. But what was interesting in his approach and what he did with the local authority is that there's a condition that he can, from an ancillary perspective, have an online off-license use. And so what he does is when people come in and buy their drinks, he tries to then sell them his products online and get that aspect of the market. So it means that he can keep a public community facility in this town whilst also making sure that from a viability perspective his business is successful, because he can take advantage of the ever-growing online market. And yeah, Charlotte's going to talk about Cheltenham.
Yeah, so a local example, their brewery in Cheltenham. It's a microbrewery, and it had its use changed in 2016 from B1, B2 and B8 to the same uses, but for the allowance of A4 as well. So they were able to open up a couple of days a week and sell their produce. As part of that, I haven't been myself, but I know people that have, and they said it's a really good atmosphere, and they've brought other local food establishments along as well. So it's just a good example of how pubs can diversify their uses. Also, another example in Cheltenham, they have recently relaxed their planning restrictions to allow temporary structures and buildings to be placed on land without planning permission for the next 6 months. So they'll have a review on that in December at the end of this year. And as part of that, businesses can submit applications to the council just to notify them. And it will include information as to what the structures will look like, its purpose, and how safe that they will be. So yeah, it's creating a good atmosphere in Cheltenham at the moment and just allowing for that flexibility. A scheme that my company has been working on recently, just as a final example for me, was within Cornwall district. They're seeking to change the use of a pub to a pub cafe, European style. So as I mentioned previously, kind of responding to what the current generation might want more, and diversifying its use. And they're using the kind of cafe element to help secure the viability of the pub.
Yeah, and the final example is one that we did a job on in sort of South Bristol area. That I think that's Temple Inn is a great example of the traditional way planning can respond, I guess, to diversification, and comes back to what we spoke about a moment ago. That I mean, in that particular case, the pub had a very big car park and which wasn't being used, and so the application sought to diversify that with housing, which with the profits going back into the pub, and B&B aspect as well to ensure that the market would, the pub could run in the long term. So it's planning for short and long term, obviously as part of the planning application process and for policy. I think that's all of our slides from memory, Charlotte. Fantastic. So I guess the question is, what should we be doing with our pubs, to everyone?
Wow, you really got me thinking then. You're absolutely right about the role that pubs play as community hubs, and I think that has really come out in the COVID crisis. I don't know about you, but I live in a village with 600 people. We have a pub, and it's still there, which is brilliant. But come COVID, the people who ran it, they were outside with a table every evening, and they were selling bread, milk, eggs, the basics, flour that nobody could get. Somehow they got. And that was a fantastic thing that they've done. But then it got me thinking, as you were saying, well, how come we've still got a pub? And part of the reason we've still got a pub is that it's not owned by one of the big breweries. It's actually privately owned. And then it got me thinking about, well, what about the pubs in the villages round about? Because funnily enough, they've all got pubs too. and all of them are not brewery controlled. And what I'm very much aware of is that the part of the issue is that control from a brewery and the rents that they then charge to the landlord to keep them running. And there's been times where that's just not been viable. So there's been more negotiation, certainly in our region, for groups or people to get out of that landlord control, to buy the pub in essence. And to do that, there's been enabling development. So as part of their financial case to raise the money to buy it, sometimes they've put new houses, as our pub has, on what was the pub garden, which has caused a problem in COVID. The car park is now the pub garden where everyone sits outside, which then knocks parking onto a street. But it's part of how do you actually raise the money to keep things going. So I think, to me, everything you've said is absolutely spot on. It's about diversifying, because those people who then own it serve much more of a local market, and they know what they can do to support their local community. So I really liked what you said about the community value, about putting into the equation for viability, cultural and social, and recognizing that we need to be more flexible. And I suppose, really, I'm very much interested to know what you think about this, but two things. Firstly, we've got the number of pubs that people always quote as closing, but the two of the three examples you gave are pubs opening, which is fantastic. So is it actually what's happening that it's part of the natural change and evolution of settlements and the way we use land and places, and to say that these pubs, this is how they were and they've got to stay a pub forever, actually isn't necessarily reflecting the way society changes, we change, places change, and ownership and things like that. So really quite interested to hear your thoughts on all of that. That's me dumping my thoughts.
I think it's quite interesting. I mean, I work for a developer that looks for land around the country, and quite often you're looking at old housing estates, and you find a planning permission for a pub that was thought of and thought was a great idea for a community in the middle of a new housing estate, but quite often they haven't been developed yet. And these are areas that people aren't investing in new pubs in new communities. I think old pubs in old communities are going to be supported, but quite often they're spaces that we all think would be a great idea, but quite often are just not delivered in good time. So I mean, I think also I did some work when I was in planning consultancy for pubs that just weren't fit for purpose in terms of they had residential accommodation above where the people used to previously live and work in the same place, and then they were then changed into apartments. So it was quite a good sort of change of use. The pub got some money because they got to sell off some apartments above, or perhaps had some development in a large pub garden where they didn't need it anymore. So actually sort of windfall sites in town centres can be quite often the site of the old pub. I'd also like to apologise if anyone saw my window cleaner that came earlier. I didn't know he was coming, so sorry about that.
I work with neighbourhood planning groups and on the local plan, and I know that when speaking to members of the public and neighbourhood planning groups, that's one of the community facilities are one of the first things that they're wanting to protect. It's high up on their agenda. In my view, the way that they're being used is changing. They seem to be used by the different generations to the younger generations are using the community facilities more than youngsters are, and so I'm not sure how the neighbourhood planning groups would feel about giving too much flexibility to changing the use on pubs, but then at the same time, I think and we don't want to jump and change anything. I think Chris said that before. We don't want to have a new knee-jerk reaction to anything. But I definitely think the way that they're being used is changing, and planning will have to adapt to that, won't it?
Yeah, that picking up on what Francis was saying from neighbourhood planning group's perspective, but from experience at local authority, it was always quite key to keep hold of these community assets and always argue that you have to prove that they're no longer viable and that nobody's using them and give us X amount of times evidence to demonstrate this. But with COVID, developers have suddenly got themselves a good number of months in the bag to say, well, it's definitely not viable this time around. So I guess whatever changes that are implemented are going to have to be implemented pretty quick, because otherwise we will start losing them. Which again, yeah, it's slightly against the idea that, yeah, these townscapes are changing and the use of the buildings needs to change. But as a general rule, if we do want to protect some of them, or at least a handful of them, then it's going to have to be changed that's brought in pretty quickly.
Yeah, protecting them from changing into a different into operating differently from a pub to a takeaway might prove a challenge in the future, because I know that the change of use order now, I don't know if it's been modified yet, but certainly proposed to put takeaways and pubs in the same use order, so not just under permitted development rights, but to just for the same class. And in that sense, then how if everything's moving to a mobile, wanting to get a quick meal instead of a communal kind of pub experience, then how do you protect the pub from kind of changing use and losing that community aspect of what it really represents?
So is it now over to you again, Elliot, to move us on? That was really interesting discussion.
Sure. Yeah. Emily, would you like to get us started?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties. So my topic is to discuss my thoughts on the changing perspectives on open space as a result of coronavirus. And I'm specifically looking at Bristol as a kind of case study example. So this slide just looks at the existing open space, which is set out in the Parks and Green Space strategy that Bristol adopted in 2008. And it's a 20-year investment programme for the future provision of green space in Bristol. So the pre-COVID status and strategy sets out that in 2007, Bristol had 3.8 hectares of open space per 1,000 resident, with a predicted growth population by 2026. It's estimated that this will be reduced to approximately 33 square metres per capita. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So this just kind of sets out the existing open space guidance for Bristol. There's quite a lot of policy documents, so I won't read it all, but the core strategy kind of sets out that an appropriate amount of open space should be provided for new development. And the green space strategy sets out that there is a certain amount of distance to existing open space and appropriate sizes of the open space there should be and would be required for development to provide. And also the recently adopted urban living SPD, which looks at the minimum amount of open space for private outdoor space and also play space for children. So all of this guidance has been prepared pre-COVID and allows for new development to provide a suitable amount of open space already. But kind of during COVID and even now, open space has had quite a bit of press and spotlight surrounding it, especially at the beginning of coronavirus when you were only allowed to go out of the house one time a day, and people would tend to go to their local green space. And even when restrictions have been lifting, the use of green spaces just from observing have been used more than they previously would. But I've also seen, on the other hand, on the news and also as you saw on the previous slide, particularly in Bristol, there are certain locations and places that don't have open space around them. So by walking, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, they don't have the same access as others do to open space. And it may just be a local park that's in walking distance that may have been closed during coronavirus. So it's kind of just making sure that those kinds of communities are being inclusive during this time, and kind of forward thinking to what is next as well, which leads on to the next slide, please, Charlotte. So now it's kind of looking to the future and kind of what can be done to increase the amount of open space and access to open space, and in particular what the planning system can do as well. So these questions and thoughts are kind of what I was hoping the discussion can be on, but as a summary, and also looking at Bristol again, Bristol has their guidance set out in the policy documents, but is this enough? And are other authorities kind of using the same level of guidance, or do they have more or less? And also in terms of public consultation, usually when you're presenting new development to residents, the main questions you get are surrounding traffic, as kind of the main thing that they want to know the answers to. But will there be a kind of change in behaviour from these usual questions, and will they be asking, will there be enough open space or access to open space for these new communities? And particularly, another example in Bristol, they're proposing to pedestrianise areas of the city centre, particularly as social distancing is becoming the new normal, and it will encourage walking and cycling, reducing air pollution and making the streets available for commercial and other cultural activities such as outdoor seating areas, temporary outside structures for food and drink venues as well. And kind of looking back at the statistics in the first slide around the increase of the reduction of open space, will there actually be an increase in the amount of open space, or will there be a more increase in the open space that developments will provide, being open space led developments rather than residential led developments? And then just kind of another example of Bristol, they're currently in the process of undertaking a local plan review. They undertook their first consultation in 2019. As part of that consultation, they included a document about which set out the proposals for protection of open space and assess the open space that was existing and set it against a particular criteria. The local plan review was subsequently paused due to the withdrawal of the joint spatial plan, and the next stages of the consultation are being held next year. So it'll be interesting to see if they kind of provide any more information on existing and proposed open spaces as a result of coronavirus. So these kind of questions and thoughts are kind of open to discussion. And what do you kind of think the benefits and implications are to having access to open space and open space led developments?
Wow, another thought-provoking one. Through each of the presentations, my mind's been going off like that because they're so stimulating. And I think one of the biggest questions that jumped out to me as you were saying it, you were talking about the space standards, and you actually raised the question about how are they spread out across the country? Are we all working to the same standard? And there isn't one, is there? There is nothing. And surely that we should be having, as people should be calling for, a minimum a space standard now, especially in the light of what's happened in COVID, because COVID has been so unequal in terms of its impact on people, and it's targeted the disadvantaged. It's targeting those who don't have access to open space, and those who, the real correlation between health and between air pollution and COVID, and why haven't we got it? And if I've got anything that I'm really worried about, it's these PD proposals that the government are coming forward with at the moment that don't have any consideration, if you change an office to residential, for the open space that's round about. And we've got to fight it. And I'm passionately going to fight it as best I can. But I think what you've done is actually put in my mind another question that goes with that. And that's, why aren't we setting some minimum standards? So I think there's some really, really interesting stuff in what you're saying. And I think it is starting to come through in the press. Both the red tops and the main broadsheets, they're actually starting to question access to open space. But then you've got to balance, they're also balancing it with, well, we need houses, so which one's going to go where and what? So I'd be really interested. Can you give me some challenges that I can, some food for thought that I can try and raise when people sort of start to tout building on open space or start to ask about standards?
Yeah, I mean, I did some representations on the London plan, and if London as a city can come up with open space standards and work it out and go through the viability, then surely any city in the UK can, because, you know, we all know that London's got the most expensive land in the UK. So I think maybe going there to sort of start from where, I think a lot of sort of local plan, you know, Birmingham or Manchester or London, when they start to look at things, they start to trickle down, you know, from there, that they have plans, you know, that can work and can be sort of looked at nationally. You don't have to worry about them being unviable if they're viable in London. So that'd be my thought on it.
The TCPA, you know, the Healthy Homes Act.
Yes.
That's a good place to start. It's got some very interesting ideas in there, and personally, I think that's the direction we should be moving in.
Yeah, I'd share that point with Francis. I think it comes also down to, isn't it, the National Design Guide that's come out as well. You know, we talk about designing good places, and yeah, through that guide, there's nothing about standards about open spaces or anything like that. And it's actually quite shocking, really, sort of talking about it and sort of hearing from everyone that, yeah, we don't really have that as a sort of minimum standard, particularly given not only the social benefits that come around with open space, but the environmental and to some extent economic as well from that as well. So yeah, it's certainly something. Yeah, that sort of the need for open space is something we really need to plan for. Actually, it sort of makes me come back to your original comment, Sue, about that. Yeah, 80% of homes are going to be that we've got now is going to be around 2050. So do we need those open spaces to be there as well as part of those homes?
And I think I don't know whether it's just being a bit Devon, Cornwall centric and Somerset centric, but we kind of benefit from open space, I would say, more than most places. So particularly I know Exeter have a particular space standard for new homes, and from memory, I think some of the other district authorities also do. But at the same time, outside of the built-up areas, it is essentially just open space. So I guess we have a bit more of a benefit than your larger cities. So on that, maybe if there was something coming from government, maybe that is to be included in the nationally described space standards, because at the moment, obviously, it's just internal. But perhaps if they had a requirement, then that would set that nationally. But then I suppose at the same time, the risk of that is then if there are councils that are looking to be a little bit more progressive than that and they want larger space standards, it'll always come back to, well, the government have set this, so that's what we're going to achieve, and then you're kind of held to ransom by the government document. So perhaps stronger policy wording somewhere about providing open space, but maybe leaving it open-ended for councils to make that decision in their own policy documents might be the best option.
Just to quickly latch onto that, Keegan, it's about accessible open space as well, because you know, we're in Dorset and it's all trees and countryside, but it's about making open spaces that are accessible as well to everybody. I think that's important.
Going back on your viability point, I think maybe we could take some of the elements of the previous slides again on the other presentations, whereby could allowing temporary uses onto these spaces therefore encourage areas or local authorities to have more open space within their area. For example, again, using Cheltenham, when I referred to the temporary uses, the temporary use of land, there was specific reference on the council's websites to the number of public and private gardens that we do have in Cheltenham, and so whether maybe those kind of uses could uplift the local authorities want to have those spaces. Aside from that, again, another appeal decision that recently came out, I think it was 2 days ago actually, or 3 days ago actually, sorry, but it was about open space. And I think, Sue, you picked up on the fact whether the loss of open space is going to be more extreme now. Here, the inspector dismissed a proposal for an affordable housing scheme because it resulted in the loss of open space. And that space wasn't a formal green open space either, but due to COVID, the inspector put great weight on that loss. And as part of that, apparently there was evidence from the appellant to suggest that it wasn't used frequently, but the inspector again just felt due to COVID that everything's heightened in that respect, so he dismissed appeal on that basis.
Brilliant. I don't have much to add. Keegan took pretty much everything I had to say, so we're just going to wrap this up with some thank yous. Unless, Sue, you have anything you'd like to say about these presentations?
Probably the biggest thank you of the lot. They were absolutely brilliant. I've loved it. I've really, really enjoyed it. So, and the quality of what you put forward and the thought that's gone into it, it's really, really impressive. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, yeah, that's about it from us. I hope you all found this interesting and worthwhile. I'd like to thank everyone for taking part and taking the time to attend and to hear from the young planners in the region. I speak for everyone when I say we appreciate it. So thank you.
I'd love to do it again. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Well, you're always welcome. Take care, everybody. Bye.